Remind members that they are obliged to declare any relevant financial interest or otherwise before taking part in the committee proceedings. Does any member have anything to declare? Okay.
No. Just in terms of Speaker's role.
Okay, yes, some of the Deputy Speaker.
Yeah.
Okay, anybody else? No, we're okay. Okay, we'll move to the next item, which is agenda item number 3, which is draft minutes. Could I refer members to the draft minutes of the meeting held on the 16th of September, which are at page 6 of the meeting pack? And apologies, I wasn't able to attend that meeting due to illness, but any of those that were present, happy with that their draft minutes proceed?
Yes.
Content, yeah. Thank you, members. Agenda item number 4, matters arising. I have none. We move to the next item of business, agenda item number 5, which is review into the Assembly and Executive Reform. We'll have an oral evidence session from Professor Tong, Dr. Hockey and Professor Nixon. So could I seek agreement from committee for the oral session to be recorded by Hansard, which is practice, standard practice?
Agreed.
Agreed, okay. I refer members to the following documents in the meeting pack: secretarial briefing page at page 14, terms of reference of the review, page 16, and review questions on citizen speech at page 18. The updated consideration of the evidence, page 19, written submissions and biography of Dr. Hockey, page 54, for John Tong, page 60, and for Professor Paul Dixon, page 64. So we'll welcome in our 3 participants whenever we're ready.
Morning.
Morning. We'll give you a wee bit of a moment there just to get settled in. Okay, well at this stage could I, on behalf of the Assembly Executive Review Committee, welcome Dr. Sean Hockey, University of Liverpool, Professor John Tong, University of Liverpool, and Professor Paul Dixon, University of Leicester and Queen Mary College, London. Gentlemen, thank you very much for making time to come to the committee this morning. We plan to give each of you up to 10 minutes each to outline your particular presentation, followed by questions if anybody has any from the committee. So it's up to you in which order you want to go on. I'll just hand it over.
Okay to start, is that okay? Thank you, Chair, and thank you, members, as well, for the invitation to be here. So I did make a written submission to the committee, and hopefully members will have had a couple of minutes to read through that. So I won't go over the detail of that for the sake of time, but I thought it would be helpful to kind of summarise the broad brush strokes of that paper, kind of in relation to 3 questions: the why, the how, and the what. So why might there be a case for reform? What reforms are we talking about, and how should we go about that in terms of process? I think in terms of the why for reform, the institutions in the past couple of years, I think, have made the case for some reform themselves. So we know in the past couple of years the institutions have kind of revealed themselves to be quite vulnerable to instability, and that has had obvious consequences for public services, but it has also been quite damaging to public confidence in the institutions as well. So when we asked last year in the Northern Ireland General Election Survey about public confidence in devolution, less than 20% said that they had confidence that these institutions were going to stay up. Most people thought that they were likely to collapse again. So I think if we're interested in kind of improving public confidence in devolution, we might want to ask how we might be able to stabilise the institutions better in terms of TEO reform, and I'll kind of turn to that in a bit more detail in a few moments. I think the other thing I'd say, and this is a basic point here, but it's an important one, is that institutional review and reform is healthy for a democratic system. Political institutions do not, or at least they should not stand still. And there is, of course, a time and a place for reform, and I was in agreement with the DUP position in 2022. I was before the Westminster Northern Ireland Affairs Committee, and I think it was Carla Lockhart who said, it would be a grave mistake to reform the institutions while the Assembly was collapsed. And I made the same point at a conference, I think it was in 2019, when the institutions were down the first time, that if you want to reform power sharing, you have to involve the power sharers. Otherwise, you're kind of risking the democratic legitimacy of whatever new institutional arrangement you get. But we are members in a different time and place now. The institutions are back. We have relative political stability, and we're on the cusp of 30 years on from the Good Friday Agreement. So when we take all of those different contextual factors into account, I think it's actually harder to make the case for no reform. To essentially say, we've devised this system, nearly 30 years ago in the heat of a protracted conflict, and now 30 years later, that system should stay exactly as it is. We shouldn't change it. That's not to say that there should be major reform. I don't think I would make the case for kind of sweeping or swift reform. But I do think a case can be made for kind of gradual and incremental reform. You might hold the view, members, that the system should stay as it is, that it doesn't need reform. And that, I think it's a legitimate view to have, but it's worth pointing out that it is a minority view. When we asked people last year in the election surveys, that was over 2,000 face-to-face interviews across the north, and we used quota sampling so that it was kind of representative of the population. What we asked people about the extent of reform, so should there be none, some, a lot, or do away with the system and start from scratch. Only about 26% of people think that the system should stay as it is, i.e. don't touch it, leave it alone. The majority of people think that there should be reform. Now, there's a difference of opinion on the extent of that reform, and most supporters of reform would lean towards kind of moderate reforms rather than significant or extensive reforms.
Dr. Huggy, on that point, would you have a breakdown of those figures? So obviously 28% should stay as is. What about for moderate or major reform? Was there a breakdown on the percentages?
I think, so of those who support reform, Chair, more than 55, I think, are in favour of moderate reforms or some. But we do, I'm in the process of writing a paper for a conference, Chair, and I've broken it down by party political support as well. So I could send that to committee.
Share that with the committee?
If that would be helpful. So that view of no reform, keep the system exactly as it is, that's a minority view. And I think the point to be emphasised there is that it's a minority view within nationalism, within unionism, and within the others. So there's cross-community support for a degree of reform, but as to what the extent of that reform, that is to be further teased out, I think, in further research. In terms of what those reforms would be, I think John's probably going to speak more about cross-community voting, so I'll talk more about TEO and how we might be able to stabilise TEO in the event of another collapse. I think that the standout candidate in terms of potential reforms to TEO would be to make the nomination rights to TEO transferable. As we know, the system at present is such that a lot of power is concentrated in the hands of quite a few people, and by few I mean small, so that one party can kind of unilaterally collapse the system and prevent its re-establishment if it wants to. When we asked people last year about that scenario, so we essentially said, okay, imagine a First Minister or a Deputy First Minister is going to resign. What do you think should happen next? 16% of people support the status quo. So 16% of people think, yes, if you have a First Minister or a Deputy First Minister who resigns and they don't want to reappoint to that office, then the executive should indeed come to an end. The system should come down. But the majority of people, and it has to be said again that it's the majority of unionists, nationalists and others, they believe that the right to nominate should transfer to another party. Now, again, Chair, there's disagreement as to what the next party means. So some party supporters, and this is where there's agreement between Sinn Féin and the DUP voters, or the majority of DUP voters and the majority of Sinn Féin voters, think that the right to nominate should pass to the next largest party of the same designation. So if a unionist is resigning, it should go to the next biggest unionist party. Or if a nationalist is resigning, it should go to the next biggest nationalist party. The Alliance, for example, most Alliance voters think that it should just go to the next biggest party, regardless of designation. Close to a majority of SDLP voters think the same. So there is some disagreement as to what the detail of that reform could be. In terms of Assembly reform, and I'm not going to talk too much about this because I think John will, I think you can make a fair case for a gradual reform of cross-community voting rules. So at the moment we have parallel consent and weighted majority, so 50-50-50 or 60-40-40. And in the paper I've suggested that we could move away from that gradually, so that you might want to, for example, use a difference blind weighted majority for instance, the election of Speaker, and you could reserve or keep the kind of traditional veto that used designations in the cross-community vote for things on which a petition of concern have been triggered, or for some of the other key decisions that are pre-designated in the Northern Ireland Act. I do think that should be gradual. I think that if we are going to have reform of something that is pretty fundamental to the Good Friday Agreement in terms of how we measure cross-community support, I think that should be done incrementally and over time. But a caveat I would make to that is that, you know, we're not rewriting the Good Friday Agreement when we're using a difference blind weighted majority. You know, it's often a forgotten fact that it's a difference blind weighted majority is in the Northern Ireland Act. If you wanted to prematurely dissolve the Assembly tomorrow, you use a difference blind weighted majority. Decisions relating to the Auditor General, decisions relating to standards, the Commissioner for Standards, all of those things are decided by a difference blind weighted majority. So I think there is precedent, institutional and political and legal precedent for a difference blind weighted majority of 2/3 of MLAs to make some important decisions. And then lastly and briefly, in terms of the how, the process. So if we want to have institutional reform, how should we do it? Or perhaps I should say, how should we not do it? I think if there's going to be reform, we shouldn't leave it to kind of party political leaders to negotiate behind closed doors. I think the process needs to be as inclusive as possible, and it should have kind of mechanisms for civic input. And there's different ways or different mechanisms that the committee could explore. The Assembly could do its own research, similar to the political engagement strategy or survey that the Assembly undertook in, I think it was 2009, if members remember, although I think most members weren't here in 2009. So you could have a survey that kind of looks at reform options in more detail. You could have citizens' assemblies. I think they're a better tool for potentially complex subjects like institutional reform, because they give people information and time to deliberate and to discuss their views with others that might disagree with them. But I think the important point, and this is my last point, Chair, is that the Assembly should be in the driving seat of that reform process. I don't think we need to have a crisis to renegotiate reforms, or we need to bring in the British and Irish governments, or we need Richard Haas or anyone else. I think this is a moment for the Assembly to take control, to grab the bull by the horns and to kind of demonstrate its capacity to deal with a potentially difficult issue in a mature and inclusive way. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Next.
Thanks very much, Chair. Thank you very much, members, for the invitation. Much of what I'm about to say will echo what Sean has said, so I will keep my comments fairly brief, because there'll be a lot of repetition. I mean, the first point I want to make is Assembly reform isn't the key to making the political institutions work better. It's much more about behavioural factors than institutional ones. That's not to underplay the importance of institutional tweaking, institutional reform where necessary. I mean, there's an awful lot of support for the existing system in many ways. There are very few takers for direct rule. Every single survey, not just our own at the University of Liverpool, on which I've worked with Sean, show that the very few takers for direct rule. The system is inclusive and proportional, and coalitional government is very difficult. I mean, I'm just hot-footed from party conferences where single-party government has proved rather difficult. So the easy option is to do nothing, but that would assume that everyone is content with some of the negatives that we can highlight, that the political institutions have been missing in inaction for more than 35% of the time since their creation. You have cross-community voting, which excludes, in effect, the main cross-community party here. There's possible deterrent effects. What's really hard to measure, but we have tried to measure it, is to what extent does the fact that the institutions are predicated on unionism versus nationalism, nationalism versus unionism, do they deter those who are neither unionists nor nationalists from voting? If you look at the extent of turnout amongst nationalists and unionists, it's far higher than those who say they are neither unionist nor nationalist. Now, that's not just a product of the way the institutions are created, but it is a contributory factor. Sean has highlighted, only 16% say they are confident the Assembly will not collapse again. Whilst the growth of private members' bills has been very welcome, the fact is there was only 4 legislative acts passed after the Assembly resumed, 2 of which were budget acts which had to be passed. And also, there's been a falling behind. I think that, we've got to look comparatively. Scotland and Wales have progressed and fully developed as parliaments. Could you say that about the Assembly? So there's a case for reform based upon those negatives, and it's also absurd to suggest that reform necessarily threatens the Good Friday Agreement. There's been lots of tweaks since. The St Andrews Agreement most obviously changed time limits over executive formation and official opposition, a justice ministry versus via a cross-community vote. So the issue is how to modify power-sharing principles within the context of the Good Friday Agreement. That's the point to make. So what reforms could we advocate? Well, the first one is the obvious one, the low-hanging fruit, and it's been kicked around for so many years that I understand if the members are bored of this, but First and Deputy First Minister, the title of Deputy First Minister is fundamentally misleading. Emma Little Pengelly isn't a deputy to anyone, in the same way Martin McGuinness was never Ian Paisley or Peter Robinson's deputy. It's misleading. It's the wrong title, and it makes sense to reclassify as joint First Ministers. A personal view, but I don't think there will ever be a runner, is I would welcome the day when there was a single First Minister and that you had the power sharing within the remainder of the executive, but I don't think that would ever run politically. So I'd also make block designation immaterial in filling the deputy First Minister post, because
repeat that again, John.
Sorry, I would also make block designation immaterial in filling the deputy First Minister post. So in other words, it would go to the leader of the next largest party,
rather
right?
than the same designation.
Yeah. There's also, just in terms of day-to-day workings, I don't think the First and Deputy First Ministers should be able to block items appearing on an executive agenda. So those are the changes in terms of FM and DFM. In terms of communal designations, once upon a time I'd have been slightly more gung-ho in getting rid of them, but Sean has touched on this. When we've actually asked members of the electorate, they're not as keen on getting rid of the communal designations. They see that the risks with that, in terms of getting rid of them wholesale. But what you could do, should it be I think the question to ask is, should it be the first thing that a newly elected MLA does, is to designate as unionist, nationalist and the rather reductionist other? Should it be the first principle, or should there be scope to designate as unionist, nationalist or other on certain votes? And I wouldn't pre-specify what those votes should be, but I think there's a case for allowing communal designations, but only in certain circumstances. In many ways, that would consolidate the existing reality. More than 80% of votes here are not taken on a cross-community basis anyway. So you can get slightly too hung up on this idea that we have to have communal designation. For many votes, I think you could rely upon weighted majority voting. I'd go more towards the top end to reassure representatives of each community that that their interests would still be represented. So I'd be in favour of 70% supermajorities. I'd go higher than 65% if necessary. I mean, if you're talking about a 70% supermajority, if you discount the Speaker, you're talking support from 63 MLAs, which is a substantial number of MLAs to get something across the line. And I think that would be, workable. But 65% would represent 58 MLAs minus the Speaker. So there would still have to be substantial support from a big swathe of the Assembly to get a measure through. But we've got to be careful about getting rid of the communal designations wholesale, just to echo Sean's point, because when we put, for example, in the 2019 general election study that we did, for example, we asked, when we said, should legislation require support from majorities in each community, and by that we meant unionism and nationalism, a majority of electors responded yes. So, they were not gung-ho for the removal of those communal designations. There was actually only a small percentage who dissented from that, so they accepted the principles that legislation should have support from communal designations. So I'm not advocating getting rid of them wholesale. I'm saying you can confine it to specific legislation. Okay? It would be a tweak of the system rather than an overall bulldozing. Just a couple of other recommendations to finish. In terms of trying to collapse the institutions, trying to prevent, I should say, the collapse of the institutions. Sean has highlighted the fact that more electors said, well, if a party quits or refuses to nominate, that more said transfer to the next largest party within the same bloc rather than transfer to the next largest party. Again, that shows that the public is wary of dismantling the communal designations wholesale. But I think you should at least have the opportunity for the next largest party within the bloc to nominate. I mean, I was quite taken when Naomi Long at her party conference said, who here thinks that parties would quit if they knew that the business of government was going to carry on here? And it is a point that does resonate. Would they quit if they knew that business would carry on? I see the dangers with it. If you look at the size, the difference in size of MLAs between Sinn Féin and the next largest nationalist party and the SDLP, if you look at the difference between the DUP and UUP in terms of seats, you'll see, this is problematic. But I think there is a case for it. A move to qualified voluntary coalition would work. In terms of nominating a Speaker, I back what the House of Commons Northern Ireland Affairs Committee said, that a 2/3 vote in favour to nominate a Speaker seems reasonable. And one final curveball point. For the status of the institution, I'd actually rename it. Northern Ireland Assembly should be a Northern Ireland Parliament, in the same way that Scotland and Wales have their own, they're called a Parliament. An Assembly doesn't have the same status. That might have to be accompanied by fiscal powers, but I think in terms of the status of the institution, it would be useful. Thank you.
Food for thought. Professor Dixon.
Hello, thanks very much for having me. My presentation is rather different to a lot of the submissions that you will have had already, because my interest is much more in the politics of Northern Ireland and how constitutions arise from political conflict. But I'll try and contextualise some of the debates within academia around constitutional issues, and then just talk a bit about how the Good Friday Agreement came into being and the role of politics in doing that. So first of all, I divide up into two groups really. The constitutional traditionalists, who tend to have a one-size-fits-all solution to conflict in terms of constitutions. And they tend to believe that their particular interpretation of a constitution is actually correct. So here we've got two groups. We've got the consociationists that you might have read about, or what I would call segregationists, simplified, but it gives you a good idea. And then we've got the integrationists. Yeah, so you can see the broad differences between the two groups in their approaches. So the consociationists or segregationists believe that the Belfast Good Friday Agreement is completely consociational, and therefore politicians either consciously or unconsciously arrived at this deal based on consociational principles. They believe that it's the reinforcement of communalism and of communal identities that provide the stable building blocks for power sharing over and above them. So they would tend to see designation as a good idea, the reinforcement of nationalist unionist identities and the marginalisation of others as actually conducive to building a strong and stable peace in Northern Ireland. For them, segregation is important because good fences make good neighbours, and if you've got your communities segregated, they don't come into contact and conflict, and that allows the political elites to do the deals over the heads of the people. Consociationists in political terms have tended to be pro-nationalist because they're power sharing, so they want to give guarantees to minorities, and sometimes nationalist to the extent of insisting on their interpretation of the Good Friday Agreement, even though it might push moderate unionists out of negotiations. Integrationists, by contrast, are highly critical of the Belfast Agreement. They see it as segregationist, consociationalist, and therefore they've opposed it because they favour the mixing of communities and the amelioration of hostile identities, and even the emphasis on other cross-cutting identities, whether they're gender, race, disability and class. So they opposed the Good Friday Agreement really as a communal stitch-up where the political parties dominate, there's very little democracy and input from public opinion, and they want to see a movement away from segregated housing and education, for example, and move towards integration. So they would tend to oppose designations because they believe that reinforces hostile communal identities, and would prefer that other aspects of identity were emphasised. So what's the problem with consociationalism is, from my perspective, is that it's redefined over the years. It first came to light in the 1960s, and they keep redefining it depending on what's happening in the world. So if Northern Ireland looks as though it's going well, they want to be able to redefine their theory to claim it. When things are not going so well, they kind of say, well, Northern Ireland is an exception to the rule. So they claim success and distance themselves from failure. There's also very little evidence that the negotiators of the Belfast Agreement actually knew what consociationalism was. If you look at all the memoirs, no one's writing about how they were sitting there with the consociational blueprint. And the criticism would also be is that they tried to insist on a kind of segregationist implementation of the agreement after 1998 because they believed that they had the one true interpretation of that deal. Integrationists, criticism of them tends to be that they romanticise public opinion and voting behaviour, and that actually in the run-up to the Good Friday Agreement there was political polarisation, and opinion polls tended to suggest there was intense hostility. And that's really why politics is so important. It was about how did these political actors overcome this intense kind of conflict at a grassroots level and come to a deal within 4 years of the IRA ceasefire in 1994. So the new constitutionalists, they, on the other hand, tend to emphasise the broader context in which constitutions are negotiated, not being overly fixated on the details of constitutions, but rather looking at the broader social security context. They don't see universal solutions to conflict, they see contextual ones. So taking your principles and trying to see what the possibilities are in the political context for achieving movement towards those principles. They would also argue that constitutions, such as the Good Friday Agreement, are open to interpretation, and it was designed to be open to interpretation. Because when you're writing a constitution, what you need to have is the dynamism and the flexibility to keep the political process on the road, and so that it could be interpreted in order to address the difficulties of either Republicans or Unionists or nationalists as politics developed. So when we look at Northern Ireland and its history, we can go back to the first peace process in 73, 74, or what Seamus Mellon calls Sunningdale for slow learners, in that deal was pretty similar to what happened in 1998, except in that case there was a First Minister, there was a Prime Minister, Brian Faulkner. And similarly, back in 73, 74, there were toxic security issues and even issues within the British state managing the British Army and the security forces who tended to be opposed to power sharing. In the second peace process, to repeat myself, you've got the dilemma in 1994, you've got an IRA ceasefire in the context of polarisation. How are political actors, after 25 years more of violence, going to bring people to some kind of agreement and get a referendum passed? And I think the answer to that is that politicians used exceptional political skills and pragmatic realism, or for some they would call it deception and manipulation. And again, as Seamus Mellon quote, he said, we had gone beyond the position of who was right and who was wrong. If you can't move, then it's politically wrong. And that alludes to the pragmatism that the negotiators had on all sides to address each other's problems with their own constituency in moving things forward. There's a whole range of political skills that were used, including, of course, the kind of constructive or creative ambiguity of the agreement itself. And that's Jonathan Powell saying that the Good Friday Agreement was necessarily based on ambiguity. The two sides were far too apart to get to agreement on decommissioning, so it had to be phrased in such a way that both sides could project their desired interpretation of the text. And the Good Friday Agreement itself, in a way, failed in that Plan A was very much to build power sharing on the moderate centrist parties, and it wasn't anticipated that polarisation would continue and the UUP and the SDLP, the Alliance Party, would diminish, and so it was very much Plan B 2007, not Plan A. And even at the start of those kind of negotiations, Tony Blair in London couldn't see that there could ever be, and a lot of people couldn't see that there ever might be a deal between Sinn Féin and the DUP in 2006-07. So I guess what I'm trying to do here is look at the broader context and the politics of constitution making, in which constitutions are negotiated. The intention in the first and second peace process was both very much based on moderate power sharing and integration, and that's explicitly in the Good Friday Agreement. And St Andrews was very much a Plan B. Constitutions and constitutional change was very much the result of considerable political skills on all sides in the peace process, who understood each other's difficulties in reaching an accommodation that no one would be entirely happy with. And although integration is often associated with the moderate parties, there are traditions within both unionism, within the DUP and within republicanism that support integrationist future for Northern Ireland. So that's me.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I felt like I was back in time at Queen's University Lecture Theatre there.
You paid more attention this time.
I really enjoyed that. So for a couple of questions from me first before I'll open it up. Dr. Hoggy, your theme sort of struck me, particularly the why in the beginning, and your first point was public confidence. Could I ask, obviously, very different arrangements in Northern Ireland vis-a-vis different devolved parliaments across the United Kingdom. How did public confidence here in the institutions vary? Is there any studies to show variance across the different jurisdictions, so whether that's Wales, Scotland, and indeed the UK Parliament?
So, I mean, because the other parliaments don't have the same kind of level of, or haven't had the same history of political instability, you won't find survey questions that tackle that about, future instability of the institutions. You will find more general survey questions that deal with kind of public trust and confidence. Our scoring on those fronts tend to be a bit lower, but I wouldn't necessarily say that you can explicitly pin that on the design of the institutions. There's other contextual factors of, you know, a divided post-conflict society, polarization and so on, that can factor into people's thinking about political trust. You know, if you're asking people here about, for example, trust in politicians, you know, they might say, well which politicians?
Okay.
You know, so it does complicate things, but I think in terms of public attitudes to the devolved institutions more generally, Scotland would tend to do better, and then maybe Wales and then us.
Do we have any specific figures? Because I'm thinking, obviously, when there's instability, the question then comes that there's a lack of confidence and trust in institutions. And I suppose I see that around the world in public institutions, and I want to know, whilst I understand that there's differences in terms of the nuances and the arrangements, what I'm trying to get at, is there a big difference in how the public view their institutions in Scotland and Wales in terms of trust and confidence in comparison to Northern Ireland, Dr. Tom?
Yeah, can I take that question, Chair? Because the questions in Scotland and Wales tend to ask of their electors, do you want more powers? The lack of trust in Northern Ireland is evident because we've asked questions, do you think the Northern Ireland Assembly should have tax-raising powers? And people have tended to say no to that, whereas in Scotland and Wales, electors have wanted more powers for their institutions. And that's not just, you know, gung-ho nationalists. It's not just the obvious, you know, the SNP wanting more powers for a Scottish Parliament. But, you know, Labour in Wales has been very proactive in transforming it from a, you know, low-key assembly into a full-blown Parliament, Senedd Cymru. So I think that's the difference. Whereas when we put those questions to people in Northern Ireland, they are wary of this institution getting taxation powers.
Okay.
Yeah.
So further that point, I suppose, so support for devolution. So you talked about some of the statistics across parties and across communities. Have you any percentage figure for the percentage public that support devolution vis-a-vis those that don't in Northern Ireland? Because that obviously will feed into what their attitudes are to the institutions in general.
We might both be able to come in on this. So the first thing I'd say about that, Chair, is I was involved in a research project a couple of years ago. It was a quantitative study of attitudes to devolution, and you find strong support for the principles of devolution and the broad principles of power sharing, but at the same time, the same people, high levels of dissatisfaction with the performance of the Assembly and Executive. So it's quite a nuanced, and on the back of that, I was involved in another kind of qualitative survey, because it's hard to get your head around that sometimes. Okay, so you express strong support for devolution and the principles, but at the same time, you're expressing very strong dissatisfaction against the performance of the institutions. And whenever we got into that, and I was involved in a deliberative forum, a kind of mini citizens' assembly a few years ago, one of the main points that all of our focus groups were making is that when we were asking them to kind of assess the institutions, often they were saying, well, it's difficult to do that because they keep collapsing. So, you know, we need a period of stability to be able to make that assessment.
But is there a potential point in that a lot of the public perhaps realise that it's a complex situation in Northern Ireland with diametrically opposed views on many issues, and therefore, whilst they want the people of Northern Ireland, those that are elected, to govern, they're also realistic to understand that there will be difficulties and bumps on that journey? Is that filtering in? Because I do hear that anecdotally, I would admit from myself, but I do hear there is continually those that understand that it's not going to be perfect government. Do you find that in any of your analysis with voting and focus groups?
We put various propositions, without getting bogged down in detail. We put the power sharing system remains the best basis for governing Northern Ireland and requires no changes. 20% said, yeah, perfect, system's fine, carry on. This is obviously different from the long-term constitutional question. We ask separate questions about that. The power sharing system remains the best basis for governing Northern Ireland but requires changes to work better. 44% said that. So a cumulative total of around 65, about 2/3 of the electorate are very happy with power sharing. They're either perfectly happy with it or, yeah, it's fine, we just want it to work better. Only 6% said the power sharing system is no longer the best basis for governing Northern Ireland and should be substantially changed. And another 7% said it's never been a good basis for governing Northern Ireland.
How many percentages?
Another 7% said it's never been a good basis for governing Northern Ireland and should be replaced. So you can say there's the opponents of the system. The outright opponents come to around 13-14%. Okay? The rest of the electorate are on side, but more want changes to the system than want simply the status quo.
I suppose then that leads me on to the question around, and you've all touched on this slightly, which is what constitutes major reform and what constitutes minor reform, and particularly tweaking is some of the words that you've used. And I think that goes to the very heart. There has been certain tweaks along the road in many different ways. I regard even something small, like when we look at the issue about petition of concern, there was slight changes to that, but ultimately the petition of concern has never been used since those tweaks were made. So I would like to know what you feel is major and what's minor, and can it really be the case, because of the power sharing aspect here and because of the different community designations and strong feelings towards representation, particularly when it comes to cross-community voting and different aspects, do you believe that that type of change, which constitutes, like I would look at cross-community voting as a major change personally, from my own perspective, others may differ, but do you believe that you could have that change without buy-in from the major political parties of the different respective traditions?
I'll go first on that. I don't want to monopolise the time. In terms of what constitutes minor and major, Chair, there is a degree of subjectivity around that, and sometimes minor tweaks can have somewhat bigger ramifications. One of the proposals that I think would definitely fit into the major camp would be a kind of move towards a more voluntary form of coalition, so doing away with mandatory coalition. I think you'll struggle to get either public or political buy-in for that. We know that there's limited public buy-in from the research. The Citizens Assembly that I mentioned, that was about, should we have mandatory coalition or should we do away with it? We were with people for a day, representative sample of the Northern Ireland population. In the morning, no one had anything good to say about mandatory coalition. In the afternoon, we showed them how a voluntary coalition would work, and a lot of people were saying, better the devil you know than the devil you don't.
Interesting.
So I think on those kind of very significant structural reforms to how a government is formed, those would be better placed in the kind of longer term ambition if people, in terms of the reform debate. But you do get public buy-in on some of the more moderate reforms. So, for example, reform of TEO, so that the nomination rights would transfer. As John has pointed to, and I think I list the statistics in my submission, it's only a minority of people who think that the status quo is a good way of running that. That if a party resigns from TEO and doesn't reappoint someone, then the system should come to an end eventually, whether it's 7 days or a couple of months with caretaker ministers. You will find cross-community and cross-party support for an alternative. Now, as I said, there's a difference of opinion as to what the next party means. Some people think it should be the next party of the same designation, so they are implicitly endorsing designations. Other party supporters think that it should just be the next biggest party. So you might, on the basis of a mandate or public support, you might move that, even though it would stabilise the institutions and in terms of consequences it would be quite significant. I think that is one reform that you could implement that would have limited implications on other aspects of our system.
Yeah, because you would probably accept that if you were to move to a position where, for example, FM or DFM didn't appoint from the two major traditions or parties, that if it was to go to whoever was willing, you're then moving towards a voluntary coalition of sorts, and therefore it would not be in line with what your research has shown the majority of people would support. Would that be a fair?
No, it wouldn't. So a voluntary coalition of sorts. So people, most DUP voters, most Sinn Féin voters, and more just about more people than not, would say that it's about designation, that it should go to the next designation. If it was a free-for-all, it would be the next biggest party. But people are more likely to say that you should still be thinking about designation. That would be a qualified voluntary coalition, because you would still be saying this position needs to remain within nationalism and that one needs to remain within unionism. So that wouldn't be a kind of no-holds-barred coalition. That would be a qualified voluntary coalition.
Of the evidence that you took in terms of the designation and whether it should stay within the same traditional block as such from a cross-community position, I think it was you, Dr. Tong, or Professor Tong, mentioned Naomi Long's comments. Could you give some context to that? Was that in terms of if FM or DFM didn't appoint and that would move to a party of the same block, or that would move to other? What was the context for that comment?
Yeah, Naomi Long was addressing her party conference. I think it was it last year or maybe the year before last, where she said, "Who here thinks that parties would walk out if they knew that the rights would transfer?
Minister.
Yeah, to nominate." Now I'm assuming that
Did that
she
happen?
was. I assume that she was thinking, well, as we're the
Okay.
third largest party, that we would gather those rights. But what we found amongst the electorate was some caution that actually the favoured option, not an outright majority, but the favoured option, the more favoured option, I should say, amongst the electorate was that the nomination rights should pass to the next largest party within the same block.
Is this only for
So-
FM/DFM post, or is this for responsibility in terms of ministership?
That was the nomination in terms of the FM,
Okay.
FM, DFM, yeah, because it was the context was Stormont was collapsed at the time, yeah, so that was the context.
Because if I'm thinking of the wider ministerial positions, it did happen. The Ulster Unions, for example, did withdraw from the executive to go into opposition. So it, in a sense of the wider executive, that has happened. But our point was primarily through the lens of FM/DFM rights.
This was post the Paul Gibbon
Okay.
withdrawal as First Minister, yeah.
That's enough for me. I find that very, very interesting. I've got Matthew as the first question.
I think it's just fair to say we do have a degree of voluntary coalition already, to the extent that only the two biggest designated parties are, as it were, obliged to form to be in the executive at the minute. So neither Alliance nor the Ulster Unions are obliged to be. They're not legally obliged to be in the executive. Obviously, they're not legally or electorally obliged to be in the executive. But there's a degree of voluntary. So I think it's important just to acknowledge it. And thank you. It was really comprehensive and interesting evidence. I just wanted to. I think it's interesting, I suppose, just to restate that there is majority, and not just sort of simple majority, cross-community majority support for substantive reform. There is, however, a nuance to that, and there's a revealed tension within public opinion, which is support for the principles of power sharing. So perhaps some form of consociation. To go back to some of the theories you were setting out, Professor Dixon, versus a deep frustration with the way it's operated, and therefore a desire for reform. But just on something you said, Dr. Haughey, which was about a need for the Assembly to really press forward with this, rather than having the British and Irish governments take the initiative. It doesn't look at the minute like either the British or Irish governments are particularly interested in driving this agenda forward for different reasons. Probably their attentions are elsewhere. Why do you think the Assembly, this institution, should be driving this agenda forward? And obviously there are different views on it, but why is that your view?
I mean, I think it could be a real moment for the Assembly because, I mean, first of all, I think we have to concede that institutional reform is a difficult topic, a potentially controversial topic, and it's complex, but often this place has kind of farmed out difficult decisions to elsewhere. We've at different times abdicated responsibility and important decisions have been taken elsewhere. I think it would be the mark of a more mature Assembly if the Assembly was in the driving seat for this discussion. The Assembly might undertake its own research or have a citizens' assembly, and the results could go back, and you might say, well, we're not there yet in terms of reform. The public aren't getting behind that, but I think it would still be a badge of quality for the Assembly that it can say, yep, we engaged with people on this issue. I think you'll be able to get people to tap into the question of, what do you think of government, and do you think it would work better? I think you might get a lot of interest in that, and the predecessor to this committee, I think it was in 2013, undertook a review into institutional reform, and it kind of concluded with cautious system maintenance. Let's keep things as they are. And reform did come, if you think of opposition, but it had to come through other kind of quite difficult means, through a private member's bill for opposition and so forth. I think it's best if the reform discussion is driven by this committee, a multi-party, cross-community committee.
Okay, I can happily give evidence. I should have declared my interest, given that opposition is a part of this, that I'm also the leader of the opposition. I'm happy to give people evidence on the ways in which that's worked or hasn't worked, or opposition rights, etc. But Professor Tong, you suggested in your evidence that, and there's been a bit of and you said it out there before, Dr. Hyde, there are moderate options for reform and then more major reform. And the more major reforms are, while there's not completely agreed consensus on what's minor and what's major, one of the things that you suggested that might be, I suppose it is a major part of our political discourse, but perhaps it really shouldn't be that major a thing, given you acknowledged, Professor Tong, that it is literally one word, which is the word deputy between the titles of the First Minister. I'm just interested whether you think that's something that we should be moving to effectively equalise, sort of nearly 30 years on from the agreement, and we can go back over the history of why it exists in the first place. But you seem to think that's something that should happen.
Yes, I do, because, as I say, the title deputy is misleading. The Deputy First Minister isn't deputy to anyone. They are co-equals, and therefore they should be called joint First Ministers until you get to a time where it's not that a Deputy First Minister is no longer required, in which case you can have a single First Minister. But
Yeah.
I suspect that would be politically difficult, even though I personally think it would be desirable. So why is it's only through inertia and the status that is accrued to First Minister that people are reluctant to get rid of this. But it's a nonsense, frankly. First and Deputy First Minister, a deputy to no one. So retitle it. I mean, there has been the suggestion, of course, they should have 3 First Ministers to represent the other block. So you'd have co-First Ministers, but that strikes me as remarkably cumbersome and not
real-time rejection of that.
Not to be. Yeah, I really wouldn't encourage that. I mean, we don't know what the size of the other block will be after the next Assembly election either. So.
And in terms of, Professor Dixon, you were talking about was a kind of a very good kind of theoretical but interesting setting out of the position of consociationist versus or integrationist versus segregationist, which is a phrase you've used. I'm sure others would probably not agree with that depiction, but you said it very, very interestingly. In terms of the consociational piece, I suppose, am I right in understanding that you're effectively saying there's a form of softer consociationalism, which was the 98 agreement, and then in St Andrews that kind of hardened into a slightly harder form of consociationalism, which was, if you like, more tribal. Is that a fair way of depicting it, that consociationism was clearly a big part of the 98 agreement, and there's a debate, including in some of your papers, about which prime ministers and which politicians were aware of the theory and practice of consociationalism and whether they had read everything Brendan O'Leary had said about it? That's a debate. I don't think we need to spend, you guys would be, I'm sure, educate us all about that.
Back for that one.
Yeah, exactly. The question is about St Andrews versus Good Friday. St Andrews hardened the kind of tribal version of the tribalisation of it. I think that's. Would you agree with that? In the sense that it meant that the first and deputy first ministers were there didn't have to be a joint election. There had to be just this separate but equal mandate.
Yes, I mean, I wouldn't call the Belfast Agreement consociational. I think it's a better term to use is power sharing. They're both power sharing,
yeah.
But you can have different variations of it. And I think what I think is striking about both agreements is the extent to which it was the political representatives who led people towards a deal, and were ahead of public opinion and what was perceived to be the case in terms of voting opinion as well. And yes, I think the negotiations in between the two deals did harden the agreement, but it in both cases illustrated the ability of political actors in Northern Ireland to actually lead the people of Northern Ireland to a power sharing deal, and they weren't so dependent on opinion polls or what their perception of public opinion was. That there was some degree in which they could lead.
Okay, that's helpful. One I guess final question for me, I'm conscious where others will want to get to the chamber. Dr. Hoy, you mentioned, we talked about the Assembly, and I think this committee is kind of the vehicle that people are agreed should be where it's at least discussed at this point and considered. Do you think, depending on, I suppose, recommendations that came out of this committee, would it be one theoretical route would be this committee coming up with a set of recommendations which then were communicated either directly to the UK government or communicated via some kind of debate or motion in the Assembly, and then a mandate directly from the Assembly, which would have to go effectively to the UK government to presumably with the endorsement of the Irish government, to amend the Northern Ireland Act in specific ways. Would that be a plausible route from this committee to reform?
It would be. I mean, I think you could add a step in there, and this committee could set the terms of reference for a body of work, of research, that would give a kind of a role for civic society to contribute to that. So, for example, if you wanted to go down the Citizens' Assembly route, the committee could, first of all, members could have discussions with their own parties, assure their parties that the Citizens' Assembly would be consultative, right? It wouldn't be binding, so you're not signing the house away. And you could have a consultative Citizens' Assembly, the terms of reference for which is set by this committee. Then, on the basis of the evidence of public opinion, then you could go to the next stage. If there is sufficient, if parties are convinced that there is sufficient public support, and I think that there will be public support for some reforms, then you could follow the rest of that process. That would be constitutionally legitimate, what you're saying.
Well, it would be constitutionally legitimate to do what we're saying, but you're saying you could add in a step. Would it be possible maybe would that step be necessary for even the most, what are termed moderate reforms, or would we have to do that for everything? Or could we say, well, these are certain moderate things we can agree on here? Major things like, for example, if there was an option around more substantial change to the mandatory coalition, or more substantive change to designation, you would have to go through the public, or does it all have to go to the public, do you think?
I think going through the public would be a good insurance policy against the argument, we can't do this because the public may not buy into it. So there might be resistance on the basis, and perhaps even legitimate, to say, we can't play around with the Good Friday Agreement any further without asking people first.
We think it would be it would probably, you'd want to be strictly time limited to avoid an open-ended.
Absolutely. I'm sure this committee would do its best to define in a kind of limited way what the time scale for that would be.
I do have a couple of specific suggestions around future evidence, Chair, but I don't know if it's better to do that now or at the end of our session.
Probably towards the end, Matthew, if it was applicable. Thank you. I'll move now to Pat.
Thank you.
Thanks, sir. I just want to ask a general question first of all. I suppose irrespective of what reforms might or might not be brought in, if one of the major parties walked and left the executive and the assembly, could the institution survive with any credibility?
You want to go first, or?
I think it'd be really difficult if either of the big two walk away. It's mighty difficult. That's why, for all that many or more of the public said that if the FM or DFM quit, it should go. The rights to nomination should go to the next largest party in the bloc. The point I made was there is such a huge difference in terms of the number of MLAs between the DUP and the UUP or Sinn Féin and the SDLP that it would be difficult in terms of realpolitik for government to continue. That is a problem. Yeah, I mean, there's no hiding from that. If there was a marginal difference in the number of MLAs, I think it would matter far less. But I think in terms of the reality of the imbalances intra-bloc, I think it is problematic if a party does quit.
I broadly agree with what John has said there. The caveat I would add to it is, I think if we did reform TEO, the beauty of that reform is it would probably never be used. I think it would be a strong disincentive for a party to walk away if it knew that the effect of that resignation wasn't going to have the same kind of political and institutional consequences as it once did. You're giving up the office, but it's going to go to someone else. Now, it's not a guarantee, but you're not going to get guarantees in this business. A party might decide, come hell or high water, we are walking away here. But the bigger question is, it's fine for a party to take that view, but on any kind of liberal democratic theory, how can we justify that decision preventing a government for all of the North for as long as that party wants? I think it's becoming increasingly difficult to justify that. You could have made the case maybe in the 90s in the peace process. The communities needed that kind of reassurance that if one of them pulled the handbrake, that the system would stop. But I think, and we're seeing from the kind of public opinion evidence, that there's a lot of frustration with that. It would be difficult, Pat, absolutely, it would be difficult. But I don't think that's a sufficient enough reason for us to not consider reform.
And I suppose we're having this conversation in the context of trying to build sustainability into the institutions and confidence as well. And not just public confidence, but confidence in the members of this institution. And I'm just wondering, and it's not an issue that has been part of your presentation today, have you explored any possible mechanisms that would enhance the impartiality and independence of the Speaker, for example? Because we see now, and I suppose we're only really learning these things, that the Speaker can have considerable power in the institution. So the Speaker has the power to accept or reject amendments to legislation and doesn't have to give any explanation or rationale as to why he or she has done that. We had a recent example in the piece of legislation on the uniform bill coming through, that we had an unprecedented situation where the Speaker rejected committee amendments. And certainly the data that's held only goes back to 2011, that this has never happened before. And, having spoken to people who have been here prior to that, the understanding is that it has never happened as long as these institutions have been up and running. So I suppose I'm asking, is it not archaic for a Speaker to have such power? And should some accountability mechanism not be brought in there? Regular review mechanism, independent oversight, or the Speaker, for example, having to produce a small written explanation or rationale as to why amendments were accepted or rejected. So because the bigger issue is that a Speaker effectively has the power to shape any piece of legislation that may be passing through the Assembly, and that in itself, if the Speaker isn't impartial, reduces confidence in the institutions. I'm just wondering, have you given any thought to any of that, or what would your views be just on the conversation we're having now?
I haven't, I'll pass over to John in a second. I haven't thought about it in any great detail, Pat. I think, generally speaking, discretionary power is the kind of jewel in the crown of any speakership in a parliamentary setting, and you will find a lot of discretionary power. It's you're kind of delving into the black box of speakerships in parliamentary systems, where I think more often than not, speakers will give some rationale for their decision, but it's done as a courtesy to the House. You'll struggle to find anywhere where it's kind of in standing orders, for example, that the Speaker must justify their decision. I'll have a look, if it would be helpful, to see what some of the regulations are in other consultational or power sharing systems vis-a-vis the Speaker, because in our power sharing systems, the speakership takes on a bit more symbolic power, and there's certain power sharing contexts where the speakership is kind of allocated to particular communities because it's seen as a kind of confidence building measure that person holds that position. So I don't have any definitive answer to that, Pat, to be honest, just to say that discretionary power is kind of built into the speakership. But in some parliamentary settings, it would be seen as a courtesy to the House to explain decisions.
It would be interesting to hear, if there is any sort of international good practice where speakers do, that there is some accountability in terms of the Speaker's role.
I'll have a look.
If you could find out.
Two very quick points. I agree. I mean, it's a really important point about the independence of the Speaker. And to echo Sean's point, they have an enormous amount of autonomy. I changed the method of how a Speaker is elected to a big supermajority of 70%. I think in terms of your point, who would be the independent overseer who would appoint the independent overseer to monitor what the Speaker gets up to would be crucial, I think. You know, would they command sufficient confidence on a cross-party basis to monitor the Speaker, as it were? But I think it's a really important point, yeah.
I mean, the Assembly Commission could do something like that, but I mean, as I say, I'll have a look into it, Pat. And
I'm just throwing it out there anyway
Yeah.
for discussion. Yes.
Thank you. Just before I bring Michelle, one of your earlier points with that, I think it was the word you used, was the overwhelming evidence for substantial reform. That, from my take on your evidence, and maybe you didn't say that word, Matthew, but it is that there is overwhelming support for reform, but the word substantial is whether it's moderate tweaking versus vis-a-vis major reform. I'm right in that interpretation, aren't I? Yeah. What, say, in terms of the low-hanging fruit you talk about in TEO, particularly you mentioned some aspects. Can you answer whether or not you would refer, for example, the removal of the ability for an FMD-FM to transfer to another party within the same block? Would you constitute that as major or minor reform?
what about medium, Chair? How's that?
No, I'm genuinely interested because I think it goes to the nub of it.
I'd say that was major.
Major.
I mean, retitling is minor.
Okay.
Changing the rules it would constitute
and
major. Yeah.
If you were changing the rules further than that to say that it didn't even stay within the same designation, that it could go to the next biggest party, it's major again.
Major.
Yeah. Just out of interest.
I would just on a
Yeah.
point of clarity, I would go on major, certainly to remove designations, but if you're keeping the designations in there, I think it's more moderate, because you're still looking at the TEO within the prism of power sharing between unionism and nationalism.
Would you share that opinion,
I
Professor?
think I think I would echo that. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Michelle, sorry. I think you're the last one on the list. And this, John.
Chair, just briefly.
Okay, I'll come to John after Michelle.
Not saving the best to last then.
Do you want to forfeit?
And thank you all for the evidence. Obviously, Alliance MLA, so I'm sold on the idea of reform. It seems from the evidence that the public are also broadly sold on that as a concept. So I'm interested in the how. How do we get it done? You've talked about the need for the parties to come together and lead on that, as opposed to waiting for government or external intervention. I guess the concern there would be that those who hold the vetoes and you have an interest in keeping things as they are won't consent to that. So how do we move things forward in that kind of context?
Well, it will have to come from yourselves, because let's be honest, the two governments aren't interested in reforming the institutions. The Irish government talked about it, the current Taoiseach has mentioned it, but it's disappeared way down the agenda. The previous UK Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, said we need to wait for the institutions to be up and running and then we'll reform. And obviously he lost office. Hilary Benn, I attended numerous speeches of the Secretary of State last week at the Labour Party conference in Liverpool. There was no mention whatsoever of reform of these institutions. So you can take it from that it will have to be movement from within, with the possibility of using the public via a citizens' assembly, as Sean has outlined.
I think that's where you'll get momentum, Michelle. If now, and it's not a guarantee. As I said, you could go to the public. You could have different mechanisms for facilitating civic input and find that there is a lack of consensus on some of the bigger questions. So that's what we found with the Citizens' Assembly for whether we should keep mandatory coalition or not. But it is going to be a challenge to budge the bigger two parties on this question, and that's not an insult to either of the parties. It's in the interest of a party from a party political perspective. If you are enjoying a position of power within the institutions, there isn't an incentive to change because there's uncertainty with that. But I think one of the persuaders can be public opinion.
I'm interested in the idea of the civic engagement with this as a way to progress it. So for people to participate in that kind of some kind of forum or mechanism like that, they want to have confidence that they're going to be actually listened to, that they're not just there to tick a box. So how do you ensure that people have confidence that if they give their time, if they're contributing, that actually that will have some meaning?
I mean, the first thing I would say is, and we know this from the research, that just the exercises in and of themselves are good for democracy, right? If people think that they're being consulted, but you're absolutely right, Michelle, they want to see the outcome from that. So if there is stage 2 and a stage 3, i.e., the results of this Citizens' Assembly are going to go back to the AERC, then they might take it to the wider assembly, there's going to be a party political conventions on this, whatever. If they can see a process, even if it's not going to lead to the outcome that they want, I still think they would find it a meaningful exercise. But you're right, it can't just be a tick box exercise. But I think it would, if you do some of these exercises and find, and some parties could be surprised in terms of the wriggle room that they thought maybe wasn't there, that is there, that might help to add momentum. And as I said, I'll repeat the point that we shouldn't assume that you'll do these exercises and you'll get the end result, which is, right, back to the drawing board, we're going to significantly redesign these institutions. People might say, better the devil you know than the devil you don't, but the point is you have to ask them. We're 30 years on now from the blueprint of 1998, and I think, as I said in my opening remarks, institutions should not stand still.
Do you think it would be in the gift of this committee, in the context of what we're doing here, to try and set something like that up as part of, to inform the work that we're doing?
The committee could. I think this committee should be the kind of engine of that conversation. It could set the terms of reference for a Citizens' Assembly, for example. So yes.
Okay, interesting. And you've made the point that this is not unusual for democratic institutions to reform and to evolve and change. So what are the implications, or what do you find as the results if institutions don't reform?
It's a very good question, which I need to think more deeply about. I mean, because the other devolved institutions they've been accompanied by very serious momentum to become much more developed institutions from a low base, as I mentioned in the case of Wales. So I'm trying to think of an institution that hasn't reformed.
If you look at you could look. Sorry to interrupt, John. I mean, John's absolutely right in terms of comparing the other devolved institutions. They've had kind of less to grapple with. If you look at other power sharing systems, and I think that this point needs to be made, power sharing systems are known for their difficulty to reform. They're very difficult to reform for two reasons. One is you've kind of got baked in vetoes and guarantees into the political system, and that can create kind of institutional resistance to reform. The second reason is public opinion. The public might think, especially if the period of violence has been recent, the public might think, don't tinker with those institutions because they have been preserving peace. And if we tinker with those institutions, it might threaten the peace and we might see a resurgence of violence. I don't think you'll get that from the kind of the public opinion side of things here. If there's going to be, if nothing happens, it's going to be because of kind of institutional or political resistance. But there are consociations that have been very resistant to reform. So if you look at Lebanon, for example, Lebanon's broadly similar.
I hope you're not suggesting a committee visit, by the way.
No, I mean, no. Certainly not, Chair. But Lebanon's been very resistant to even very minor reforms, and that's getting closer and closer into the abyss. Whereas if you look at BCR, so that's the Brussels City region, there's 7 parliaments in Belgium. It's absolutely fascinating. Could talk about it all day, members. I'm not talking about Belgium in general, not the federal parliament. They're the one who stole the Guinness World Record from this place. We should have got the Guinness World Record for going the longest period in peacetime without a government. But Belgium got it because they're a federal parliament. But if you look at the BCR consociation, so that's the Brussels City region, it's about 1 million people. That's an example of a very successful consociational system. It's kind of gradually evolved and reformed itself repeatedly over the decades, and it's got very specific mechanisms for different types of reform. And I think that shows that the system, and it's held in high regard compared to the other consociational parliaments in Belgium.
And just a final question, if that's okay. In terms then, and I obviously feel compelled to raise this, in terms of the cross-community votes and designations and the fact that my vote counts for less than others, is that common practice in other power-sharing institutions like that? Is that something that happens? And can you speak to the ethics of that in a democracy, that you can be elected equally but your votes don't count equally?
Paul, do you want to come in on that, by the way? Or should...
No, you guys go ahead. I'm enjoying it.
Bosnia is the glaring example there. Very similar system in many ways, where they've tried to form.
Or sorry.
Bosnia, yeah. Centrist parties there get excluded from the system.
Yeah.
And if you look at Lebanon, you know, particular positions are reserved exclusively for Maronite Christians, Shia Muslims and Sunni Muslims, speakership and so on, whereas we're more of a kind of flexible system. We don't say the First Minister must be a nationalist and the Deputy must be a unionist. You know, there's some flexibility there. But I mean, it is a point worth making, you know, when it comes to the most important issues in this place, so the election of Speaker, the passing of the budget, the votes of other MLAs count for less than the votes of nationalists and unionists. And I've kind of taken the cross-community vote question off my list of essays for my university students in Liverpool, because 90% of the students were answering the question because they find it quite bizarre, you know, that when you get to those really important votes, you don't get one man, one vote. And for a place like Northern Ireland, where there wasn't one man, one vote for so long, to have a system now that doesn't guarantee one man, one vote, or one woman, one vote on some issues, people in Britain are quite interested.
I think we don't see the irony of that,
Yeah.
especially from the people blocking it. But anyway, thank you very much. Appreciate that.
Thank you, Michelle. Go to
Thanks,
John
Chair,
and then
and gents, thanks so much for coming along today. Really enjoyed the evidence session. I think we all agreed we could hold a 1 week conference on this and not get the result rather than a 1 hour evidence session, but I think it's really useful in the limited time that we have. Just from my point of view, I think any times we have seen change to date, it's been at periods of crisis, 2007, 2014, 2020, and invariably they are to placate those causing the crisis, and those changes are never in the best interest of Northern Ireland or this Assembly. And the only good bit of change they've seen, and Matthew alluded to it, was the private member's bill brought forward by John McAllister to bring in opposition, and that's been some progress. You talked about surveying the public and the will to see change. We can debate whether that's meaningful, major, minor, whatever that may be. What is the belief among the public that change is actually capable of being delivered by this place? And it's no disrespect to my colleagues in this committee, but any change is probably going to come through this forum. But with the greatest respect to the two biggest parties, if they decide it's not in the interest to move forward with any terms of reference or any movement forward, even consulting the public, nothing will leave this committee. So with that in mind, where do we get to then? I mean, that's the first point. And the second point, and it's for yourself, Professor Tong, regarding the public's feedback on revenue raising powers and the lack of appetite for that. Do you sense from the evidence that's because they don't trust the stability of this institution, or they don't trust the ability of the people in it to deliver effective and meaningful tax raising operations?
Well, I think on revenue raising, it's probably because they just don't want to pay, to be quite honest, more than anything. I mean, we asked that.
We're all paying anyway.
Yeah, I looked at the evidence ruefully as I paid my £400 water bill. We asked two specifics on that at the last general election last year. We asked, would you support prescription charges? Only 7% supported the reintroductions, it will be, of prescription charges. And the percentage who wanted water charges was 3%. So, you know, it's a brave political party that goes gung-ho saying, yeah, local revenue raising via those two means. I think that's just a fear of what the cost would be rather than a necessary. There is a fear of revenue raising powers being accredited to this institution, but I think that's a slightly separate question in terms of specifics on water bills and prescription charges. Okay. The first half of your question, Sean.
this is our stats man.
We haven't asked, John, to be honest, even if you support reform, do you think the parties will deliver it? I think there probably is a kind of recognition of realpolitik that it's the parties that require convincing are the two largest parties, and by virtue of their size, they have power within the institutions. But I wouldn't knock the DUP and Sinn Féin in terms of their open-mindedness to reform. I mean, this committee comes from a reform that was supported by the DUP and Sinn Féin. So you can budge the dial a little bit, I think, but it comes to whether you're just getting a bunch of academics who saying there should be reform, or political leaders saying there should be reform. I think we need to redirect the conversation. And if you're getting, if you have a body of public opinion research that is suggestive of reform, then you can put the challenge to opponents of reform and say, why do you not want reform, even though, you know, we've done A, B, and C, and this suggests that this is where the people here want to go. Why do you not want to do that? In the absence of that kind of civic voice, I think it's a harder case to make. But we'll do our best.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really useful. We'll
Carry
carry
on.
on, no doubt. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Sinead?
Thank you, Chair. And listen, my question was more or less teased out by yourself, Chair, and by Pat as well. Just for the avoidance of doubt for John, we're very much up for looking at this, and I think just through...
I was just saying you could, I'm not saying you will. But
we're here in
I'm
good
very
faith, and
interested
we're
to
here
hear
to
that.
look at the evidence in relation to it. And I think just based on the evidence sessions we've received today and to date, it shows that we still have a lot to do in terms of our homework in relation to this here. My question was around the that notion of you can if one of the two largest designations refuse to designate or don't appoint to First Minister, Deputy First Minister, that it would move to the next designation, or it would move to the next largest party. And I think even among the conversation we've had today, there's some disagreements, maybe a strong word, but there's some difference of opinion around whether that constitutes a moderate or a more major reform. And I can't move past the notion that whether, and I think it was yourself, Dr. Hockey, who had said that the public maybe prefer to go to the next largest party in that designation. But obviously if we base that on the reality of the numbers now, I mean, what legitimacy if any, would that sort of coalition of the willing, if you want to call it that, what legitimacy would that have legally, politically, to function? And I think we need to tease that out. There's a lot of unanswered questions around that for me, as to just what legitimacy that would have. Bearing in mind, the idea of the notion of parity of esteem very much underpins the Good Friday Agreement and these institutions. So how would that be protected and achieved? And honestly, what legitimacy would any sort of coalition of the willing actually have?
I mean, I think it would be an affront to parity of esteem if you were saying to a party, you can't be in the government. But if you're saying you can be in the government, but you don't have to, if you want to walk away, you can walk away. I think you can, from a public perspective, you could see democratic merit in that, where it's not exclusionary in the sense that a particular party has been thrown out of the government. They've decided to walk away from it. So if the composition of the coalition is seen to be less legitimate, that's on the party that walked away. That's on them. They've decided to do that. And if the nomination rights pass to someone else within the next designation, doesn't matter about the number of seats that they've got in the Assembly. They're the First Minister or the Deputy First Minister, and they rule the roost alongside the other person. So the fact that they've got smaller number of MLAs and perhaps account for less ministries within the D'Hunt executive, they're still ruling the roost at the top. So that designation is still getting a lot of power, regardless of the fact that the person who's appointed that minister has fewer MLAs in the Assembly. It would not be ideal. I think the ideal scenario would be that people took the positions to which they were entitled to and worked in the executive for the full mandate rather than walked away. But there is a question mark about that. We've never had that scenario in the North, so there are unknowns about it for sure.
I mean, there are competing legitimacies between party interests and bloc interests here. We genuinely didn't know, what to expect when we put the question. I mean, the way we phrased it, we just said, if the First or Deputy First Minister resigns, what should happen? And first option was the post should transfer to the next largest party from the same bloc. 34% said, yeah. And nationalists and unionists tended to prefer that option, so there was the comfort for them of thinking, well, okay, if our party from our bloc walks out, then at least we've got the comfort of, the next one down in that block. Whereas those who are neither unionist nor nationalist tended to prefer the second option, which was only supported by 20% overall, that said the post should transfer to the next largest party, regardless of whether that party is unionist, nationalist, or neither. So there are divisions. Unionists and nationalists were still thinking more in block terms. Neithers were quite happy for party to take precedence over blocks. and then you get others. I mean, that 20% is not that much higher than the percentage saying the executive is ended and there should be a new assembly election. That was 16%, and then there's the assembly, and the executive and assembly should be just abolished. There's another percentage. Yeah.
Of those figures, so no change of that category in terms of status quo stays as what was it?
Okay, the third option, the executive is ended and there should be a new assembly election, and that 16% went for that. Okay, and then there was another 7% rounding up. The executive and assembly should be abolished if parties quit.
Kind of TUV position.
Yeah.
Could I just ask a quick question? Sorry, you finished?
Go ahead.
Just if that system was introduced, it would have further implications. So let's say, for argument's sake, Sinn Féin walked. They have 25, 26 seats, whatever it is. The SDLP, for argument's sake, had 10 or 12. It would create, and on a good day,
See it happening.
but it would mean there would be a change in the makeup of the ministers within the executive.
When you're on the hunt.
It wouldn't be one post, it would be more, yeah.
So, I mean, this just isn't something that would happen in isolation. There would be further implications, yeah. That's okay.
Okay, well, can I just say, look, I found that a really interesting presentation, and I think members got a lot from that. So I really want to thank the three of you. I always said, even at the beginning of this, I think this committee has to be very realistic about what is achievable within its scope, because there is such a difference of opinion on what constitutes major and minor reform, about what people perceive that to mean, in particular regards community designations, or community vote, or cross-community voting. There's a lot on the plate there. And I would just, and it's not a takeaway, because I actually think this has been very, very useful. But if this committee came to a set of recommendations on a simple majority basis that didn't have buy-in from the major players, whether that's Sinn Féin, DUP or the other parties, do you think that that would have credibility then to go to next stages if we did decide, for example, whether it was terms of reference or whatnot? I'm just genuinely interested, because I think at the very heart of this, and you did mention it, was that if it didn't have the buy-in of the local political parties, it's very, very difficult to see progress. And I think that touches a bit on what John has said, Sinead and Pat in some of his questioning.
Yeah, there has to be near unanimity, I think, across this committee for things to move. I would strongly suggest that. Yeah.
I would go under unanimity. I think we need to be cautious of inertia, of saying, look, it's too complicated, or we don't have enough buy-in here. The committee doesn't need to commit to recommendations for reform yet. As I said to Matthew, and we're not trying to poach jobs or anything. The Assembly can do its own research, but I think that there is space for the Assembly to do something here in terms of public consultation, civic input, and then on the basis of those exercises, with the committee in possession of that knowledge, it might be a more fruitful conversation amongst yourselves.
I think I've always been of the belief, never underestimate the power of small gains, and I think that is something that bears with me when it looks towards how this place operates. But there is a difference of opinion on so many of these issues, as is even indicated in some of your polling. I think what would be very helpful, actually, to the committee, obviously condensing a lot of this, the findings in particular, the statistics, that's been really helpful in teasing out the nuances of different public opinion. Professor Dixon, would you have anything you want to add in closing comments? Because I know you have been, we've been listening to a lecture now for this last previous to.
No, I'm fine. I'm very interested to listen to these guys.
Well, thank you so much, each and every one of you, and we look forward to engaging with you further as this process continues. Thank you, and safe travels.
Thank you.
Sure, I'll get back to you with those the breakdown of those stats, and within a week, Pat, I'll send something to you as well.
Good job. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, members, I know that has run on. I think it was useful to do so, and I think members got a lot from it. So thank you for your forbearance with that, because I know the Assembly has started. Before we move on, Matthew, you had a comment?
I did, Chair, and it was really just further to this. I think that was an extremely useful session. Thank you to respective professors and Dr. Haughey giving us their evidence. I think from my perspective, it really underlined, and several things were said, including your remarks around the fact that this is critical. This is going to be, there's the public opinion, but there's also party opinion here. I mean, Dr. Haughey said at the minute, though they were excellent witnesses, he said you're getting a bunch of academics to talk to us, and that's true. I think we do need to consider doing what the NI Affairs Committee did, which is get evidence from all of our respective parties. I think we should start with the First and Deputy First Minister, and indeed we could have previous incumbents in those offices come and give us evidence. I think that would do a couple of things. First of all, we do need to establish party positions on this. We're all here as representative of parties, but we're also questioners, so we're kind of doing the homework. I think it's going to be critical, though, that we get that evidence. So I think the First and Deputy First Minister, both of whom have said in the Chamber that this committee is where reform has to be flushed out, I think we need to invite them to come and give us evidence.
So that's further evidence. We are in evidence session at the moment, so obviously I'm not going to particularly propose in relation to what has been said, but that is a suggestion for other witnesses. So certainly, I'm open to that. If Shane, I'll maybe hand to you about the process point.
Sure, could I just come in on one point? Yeah. It's about this issue that this committee needs to come to some sort of agreement, and I personally don't think that's the role of this committee. I think the role of this committee is to lay out options, which will then go up the corridor or wherever, or to the rest of the political parties who can then have some sort of negotiation around that. We can't make decisions. We can just lay out options, and I think that's the role that this committee plays.
Well, I would say, with respect to the Mayor, through the Chair, we can make recommendations. We may choose not to, but there's nothing stopping us making recommendations. I think I'd like to be honest. I think it would be great if we could, but if we can't, that's fine. But I think in order to lay out those options, we do need to hear from the First and Deputy First Minister and all of the parties represented here. And I would go so far as to say, as with the NI Affairs Committee, lots of whose homework we're piggybacking on, we could even take evidence from previous holders of the offices. I also think that would have the benefit of engaging the public out there who aren't yet engaged with this committee, and we don't want to give them the view that this is just a wee talking shop. The First Minister and the Deputy First Minister have both said in the Assembly chamber that this committee is where reform has to be discussed. They've said that to me when I've asked them and other members. If that's true, that's their view. I think they both need to come here and give us evidence, and that is a formal proposal for me that I'd like to be.
And I'll let Shane talk to the technicalities of that point too. But the committee did appeal to members of the public for suggestions and comments, and we did receive 111 submissions from the public. But hold on, let me finish. That's on one side.
Only two parties responded, and that was our party and the Alliance Party Chair. So.
But I'm talking, no, hold on. Yes. I'm talking about capturing the general public. I'm just saying that the committee did attempt to do that. Before I come to the next, I just want Shane to talk through the technicalities of Matthew's point about additional witnesses, as has been suggested.
Yeah, Chair, there's a few things there. So the committee at its last meeting agreed to proceed, two things. It agreed to proceed to take oral evidence from the list of stakeholders who had made written submissions in response to its call for evidence. And you'll see in the paper there at page 15, there's a proposal there in terms of how those oral evidence sessions would be structured and scheduled. So there's that. The committee also agreed that if necessary it could invite additional evidence from other stakeholders. So I suppose it's a question of when it wants to make that decision. Does it want to take the initial evidence first and then make that decision, or does it want to do that now?
So before I come to Michelle, I think that we have a process here at the moment. I'm not taking away the fact that we may well want additional evidence sessions from additional people, as it's been suggested, but I think we could stay on course with what we have at the moment. Because we have how many sessions?
So there's 4 panel sessions.
4 panel sessions left, and following that, because the committee can then go out for further. But before I come back to Matthew, Michelle, do you have a point?
No, I'm happy with Matthew's proposal. If it's proposal and needs seconded, I'm happy to do that. I'm not sure that it is considering what you've said, but as I say, I'm happy to second it. I have my own proposal, but if you want to deal with this first,
I'll deal with this first. Matthew, would you?
I don't understand. I don't think there's any legal or procedural technicality that stops us deciding that we are going to issue an invite today to the First and Deputy First Minister and other parties. I should be clear. This is a party thing in addition to an office holder thing. I think we should start with that. because I think it's clear from the evidence we got, and it's clear from the conversation among members, that this is going to be a discussion for parties. I think it would be a bit surreal of the public watching this, just seeing us take evidence from academics and not hear from our own parties, and indeed from the people who hold those office. So that is a formal proposal, and I haven't heard anything.
It's a fair point. So what you're suggesting is, in addition to the 4 panel sessions, we also invite FM, DFM and other parties who want to present.
It could be party leaders or representatives. There's an additional one that would be relaxed about that. So the NI Affairs Committee at Westminster also had people like former FMs and former ministers. I would be relaxed about that, but I do think serving party representatives and first and deputy first should be invited, and I think ideally we should hear from them before Christmas, but it depends on the committee.
Proposing side, but before I go to vote, Sinead, do you want to make comment?
Yeah, Chair, I'm not disagreeing with anything Matthew said, but we've had one evidence session, and I'm no clearer or no further down the line in terms of the deliberations and the evidence. I don't feel well equipped at the minute, to be widening out the scope of that there. I think we need to do the evidence sessions, and then when we get the likes of a First or Deputy First Minister or other parties, then we're better equipped to be able to question them and put our musings and our thoughts to them, and whatever conclusions we may gather from those evidence sessions. I mean, I hope I'm not misquoting Dr. Hockey there, but he said on at least 2 occasions that, this committee needs to do the preparatory work. The role of this committee is to do the homework, to do the preparatory work. It's not to essentially deliver the change, it's to do the work, as Pat said, then to pass it on to those who will deliver the reforms.
If I may, Chair, but the whole point is that we need to hear from party representatives to get that evidence. And I don't understand what the difference is between getting us. There's a slightly false distinction here, I think, between getting evidence from academics and civil society and political evidence. It's clear that this is the same inquiry, so I don't think there would be anything stopping us asking and inviting the people, or agreeing to invite FM, DFM and party reps today, and then those are already scheduled, so we're already going to have the academics who are already, so that we're already going to hear from them before we hear from, as it were, the political figures. So I think if we could agree today, and we would still be consistent with Sinead's view that we hear from some of the academics and then put those questions to the political leaders, because it wouldn't be scheduled until afterwards. So I don't know what would stop us agreeing.
So in a sense, Matthew, what you're saying is that we conduct our panel in terms of the academics and others that have submitted evidence and have been agreed to come give evidence, and then following that we also schedule in for the same type of evidence session those political.
We agree to invite them today, but we don't have to have the hearings until after we've heard from the academics. Then we can put points, and I think that answers Sinead's point, which is going straight into, if I'm understanding correctly, going straight into political evidence without a kind of basis of evidence from, as it were, independent witnesses. I think if we do the independent witnesses, but then we are agreed that we're going to get FM, DFM and party reps, we are then in a stronger position to put to them some of the things that have come out, including from the very useful session.
So we invite those parties if they wish to give evidence, and we invite the FM, DFM.
That's my proposal, Chair.
And also the other one, which I thought was actually a useful suggestion as well, those former holders.
I'm happy with that if others are too.
Yeah. Okay, well.
Sorry, Chair, can I just clarify, is that the Assembly parties?
Assembly parties, I'm not trying to exclude like the Green Party, for example, who aren't representing the Assembly, but
well, I think we have to try to.
I'd be happy with the Assembly parties.
Okay, so
and the former holders of FM, DFM office.
If members are agreed with that, I think that makes sense. It's consistent with what the NI Affairs Committee did.
I don't have an issue with that, but okay. So we have our proposal, proposed and seconded. All those in favour? Aye. Yeah. Unanimous agreement. Okay, that's very helpful. We'll move now to the next agenda item if members are content.
I put my proposal forward.
Pardon?
Shmel.
Oh, sorry. Shell, sorry.
Okay, no problem. I think almost extending what Matthew has said around getting additional input, I think the biggest flavour of what we heard today was the need for civic engagement on this. I think that was very persuasive in terms of civic engagement.
Okay.
I was persuaded, certainly, I think it was very persuasive evidence that having those kind of discussions, I know we've done our call for evidence, but this would be a very different, probably a more productive engagement with the public. So I would propose that we would work up some kind of terms of reference for some kind of citizens' assembly to engage on this process.
Okay, that is another proposal. If members are, I suppose from my perspective, I would be content to take as is suggested at the moment with the inclusion of Matthews, and then at the end of that part of the procedure then see where we are in terms of whether it's further engagement
I'm just
with.
asking for terms of reference right now, just to see what way that could manifest and how we could engage with the public. So I'm not suggesting we get them scheduled in or anything. I'm saying at this stage, if we could actually look as a committee to produce the terms of reference for a citizens' assembly on this issue, so we get that input from the public.
Yeah, Chair, so there's a few things here. So the committee's review terms of reference left open the possibility, you'll see from that the committee could, as the Deputy Chair mentioned earlier, produce like a factual report of the different options, the pros and cons. Another option that the terms of reference left open was that it would focus on specific potential reforms after, filter that down. So I suppose there's a question around what would the committee engage on, in terms so that would be important that the committee was clear in that in order for a terms of reference to be drafted in terms of engagement. So that members might need to think about that a bit
more.
Yeah.
Okay.
In principle, we could agree to do that.
I'm just not sure, Michelle, through the chair, of course. If we're drafting terms of reference for a civic assembly, is that the suggestion you're making?
Citizens' assembly. I know it sounds very grand, but it would be contained on this issue.
But for what purpose?
To engage with the public, to come and discuss the options, and it may be the options that form that report that we're doing now, the different options for reform, that's open to members of the public to actually discuss those options as well, rather than us discussing it amongst ourselves or academics discussing, actual civic representatives having those discussions. I think it would complete the loop in terms of the credibility.
I'm not being negative about this. I agree with consulting the public as much as possible. I'm just curious about the logistics of it. How would we go about doing it as a committee, I suppose, is the question I'm asking.
Yeah, Chair, sorry, Chair, there is a unit within the Assembly that has recently been set up in terms of the assist committees with engagement. So, I could look to see what the options for an engagement exercise would be, but as I said earlier, it would be important that the committee would be clear on what it's engaging on and at what stage. Would it want to gather all of the evidence on the full range of options, and then would it want to filter them those down and then engage on particular options? So there's decisions would need to be made, but certainly I could make some inquiries in terms of how an engagement exercise might be carried out. In terms of whether it be the different types of approaches and civic forums.
Okay.
And so forth.
Before I come to you, Matthew, John has indicated.
Go ahead.
So
Yeah, no, Chair, thank you. It's just to follow up on that. I mean, Michelle makes a compelling case, as did Dr. Hockey, and I have no problem at all engaging the public. I just think we might be at a cart and horse situation at the moment, and it's not kicking it into touch. I think Shane's suggestion would be, very worthwhile. We don't really know what we're putting terms of reference out for in terms of the parameters, and I think to that end it might be beneficial to see A, what the Assembly's team can do, B, what we're going to be getting that potential body to look at, and until that's the case, it could be quite difficult. So maybe at the next meeting we could hear back from that. That would be useful.
And also, I'm probably conscious of the fact, as has been mentioned in the evidence session, there's certain things that we'll not find agreement with in this committee, and before you would go to a more engagement piece with it might be nice to be able to narrow that pool of whatever could constitute agreement in this place. So I'm probably along the same lines, John, but Matthew?
I just wanted to make an observation, really. I'm broadly in agreement with Michelle's proposal. I think it is important that we, 2 points. One, I think the public does need to be consulted. We are also committed via that agreement we've probably all forgotten about now, New Decade, New Approach, which committed to 1 to 2 civic engagement exercises per year. So this would appear to me to be an obvious example where parties, us all having agreed to the principle of civic engagement back in 2020, this could potentially fit in that model further in terms of reference. The second point is I don't think we need to. I think it's clear that I'm not giving a committee view. I'm giving a personal view here that there are certain things that we as parties could agree on that wouldn't necessarily require full-blown citizen engagement. Thinking about the more minor things like equalisation of titles, for example, is one option given by Professor Tong. I'm not asking others to endorse that view, but in broad terms I agree. I think Michelle is right. So I think a terms of reference for what that would look like is really important.
So just to try to summarise this, we have a proposal which is go towards setting a terms of reference for civic engagement, as has been mentioned by Michelle. We also have a suggestion of how we could look at the evidence sessions first, Shane can also work about what that engagement would look like with the public in terms of the unit within the Assembly. And that would happen after we've had our evidence sessions and we've maybe narrowed down and thought about, well, what exactly we would be going out to engage on in the particulars. So that's, Michelle, first of all, I know you're the one with the official proposal. There's no other proposal for this. I can't, I'm in the chair. But are you content with what suggestion, or would you be wanting to continue with
I want to be sure that what we're agreeing is this is not off the table, that this is something that is going to be taken forward by this committee as part of this process at looking at Assembly reform. So if you could come back with the information from the engagement, that's fine.
what it looks like.
But I don't think that prohibits agreeing that in principle we would look to create a terms of reference to do this as part of our process at the right time. I feel like this is part of this process that we should do it.
I'm slightly confused. So your proposal still stands
My
as was
proposal still
recommended?
stands. I don't think there's anything
Okay.
anybody has said to me that means we couldn't pull together a terms of reference.
So I'm conscious
It's
that's
not-
been
it's not
proposed.
scheduled in the
To
mail or
have an
anything, it's
alternative proposal, and then we can.
I mean, I'm happy to second on the basis that what my understanding is that we are going to, Shane is going to go away, the Clark team is going to go away, engage on the mechanics and come back to us with what a process might look like, and then we can consider further the timing of it. Is that I'm happy to second that proposal.
That sounds like a different proposal. That sounds like a
Different
different second. And that was
Well,
agree a process. That was agree terms of reference.
Exactly.
That there's two different things there.
In terms of, I mean, I suppose we're agreeing the principle that we are going to look to a civic engagement exercise of some sort.
If we agree to terms of reference,
So we're getting agreed. So before I come to the proposal, is there another proposal on the table? We've had one proposal before I go to the clerk. No, clerk.
So Chair, it's just that the committee needs to be clear on what the terms of reference would be. Is it a terms of reference for how the committee would engage on as part of this review, or is it a terms of reference for what the engagement would be on? Because
I think it's a terms of reference to establish a civic, I'm calling it Assembly forum, whatever you want to call it, that would allow for the public to engage with this process. So I'm not determining right now what that is or when it happens. I'm saying that we agree that we would do it, and that would require terms of reference.
Like not engaging already through the consultation
Okay,
exercise.
so we've bandied this about we've had a proposal and seconded. All those in favour of that,
Don't want to do it.
in favour say aye or raise their hand.
Aye.
Okay.
So Chair, just so that I'm clear, sorry.
Yeah.
So is this a terms of reference, basically an approach to consultation, how the committee would consult as part of its review?
My understanding
the mechanism
is
for doing that
what you're
and the
agreeing is,
options.
if I could, is how rather than what, because I don't think the committee is yet at a place where we're making recommendations on what. So I think the terms of reference that is being described is something which says at a certain point, when the committee has either a set of recommendations or a set of views or a set of evidence that is gathered, it will go out to the public with that based, and this is how it will do it. Not what exactly will be in that, but how it will seek to.
Is that your understanding?
People are.
Absolutely, 100%.
Okay, all those in favour of that proposal? All those against? And abstain?
I'm still.
All unclear?
Yeah, to be honest, I feel for the clerks here because there's a fundamental difference between the definition of terms of reference for setting up a citizen assembly and exploring the scope and scoping out how we may go about doing something like that. That they are two totally different things. Terms of reference to me is that's the process underway. Here's we're designing a process to set up a citizen assembly.
You need a separate
The second thing is, and sorry Michelle, is that we're going to do some exploratory planning through the clerk and the assembly's process to see what that may look like in the future. They are two fundamentally different things, that's why I'm abstaining, because I don't think the proposal is clear, and I feel for the clerks in that respect because I'm none the wiser.
Well, neither am I. That's why I voted against. But I'm sorry.
No, I'm clear that I'm asking people that they would agree that we will do this. That will require terms of reference. If you think there's a separate proposal required that precedes that in terms of this procedural types, I think that will happen de facto, then I'm happy for that to come forward. But I think it's inevitable that if we're going to do a terms of reference, we will decide when in the process that happens. It feels like that will happen inevitably at the end of our evidence sessions when we have proposals in front of us that we'll put towards.
It'll be inevitable. Why, you know,
I know.
why do we need to
Recorders
make
will be
it
against.
formal
by the
thing?
way. I'm voting against if it's standing as it is. So I was trying to get some
Yeah.
movement and change.
So-
My own view is I don't want to get. I think we're getting slightly hung up on the
Yeah.
on the
Mechanics.
phrase terms of reference.
Yes.
My understanding of the proposal, but I didn't make it. Is that we're agreeing the principle that there will be a civic engagement exercise following the conclusion of this committee's evidence gathering and consideration.
That's
should it-
very
should it-
different though,
should it-
that's what I'm saying.
Tell you what, if you want me to withdraw the proposal in terms of the
would
language,
agree
in
to that.
terms of reference, I'm happy that that's the proposal that goes
Okay,
forward.
because that's
Should-
more up that I understand. Sorry,
should-
Chair,
should-
first, hold on, Pat.
But to be fair, to be fair to Michelle, that is a form of proposal which we hadn't agreed before. So I think it was reasonable that it was put on the agenda.
Should public or civic engagement not be part of the remit of the committee anyway? Is that not part of the terms of reference?
There's a consultation on the way, Pat, isn't there?
Yes,
There's 100 odd
Constitution.
responses.
Yeah, exactly. So
Guys, it's specific, through the chair, to the conversation and the evidence that we had today. That was clear that there are civic engagement forums that have been used in other areas that help to progress this type of work. So yes, there has been a call for evidence from the public, but this is a distinct and different thing. And I think that's clear and understood, and I think it's understood from the evidence here
So
what that means.
I'm going to ask the clerk procedurally where we are, okay, to begin with, because I voted against the proposal because in how I took it, and I'm not the only one, that they meant two different things. What Matthew has suggested is more clarity, accept, and that's something that I wouldn't be against, but I will go to Shane, and then we will find a way forward.
So, Chair, there has been a vote that, on a proposal for a terms of reference for a public engagement exercise, and that was passed by a majority vote, with yourself opposed and John Stewart abstaining. So I can work up a paper for the next meeting setting out how that might take. The committee might do that. The committee would then need to decide what it would consult on and at what stage, and that could be after it obviously takes all of its oral evidence sessions, and then it could decide, is it going to consult on all of the options, or is it going to narrow options down and then consult on them. But I can certainly come back on the basis of the decision that's made with a paper setting out the approach and perhaps options within that. It may not be called the terms of reference, but it's basically an approach for how the committee would undertake a public engagement
The purpose
exercise.
is to progress it in that way.
Yeah.
So thank you for finding a way to do that that wasn't amusing.
Okay, members, are we content to move on at this stage to the next agenda item? Okay. So, members are content with the suggested composition for the additional stakeholder panels as set out in 15 with the inclusion of what was suggested by Matthew earlier on and agreed. Members content? Okay, could I seek views on how we schedule further evidence sessions? I had this conversation earlier with the clerk. Because of our different committee compositions, it is hard to find additional sessions on Wednesdays and Thursdays, given there is committee members that are committed over both. I suppose where I stand as a committee chair, I think has been very useful this morning, and there's been that time and that flexibility to do it, that we continue with where we are at this stage, and we assess it as we go along, regards to whether we need additional evidence sessions, and we can see how that would manifest over time. Are members content? The options include continue to meet, as I've suggested, on a Tuesday AM, and have one panel session lasting approximately an hour. I know we've went over, but it's been useful at each monthly meeting, and then the other two options, 2 and 3. Are members broadly content?
I am broadly content, although I would just say that I think, Chair, we should keep alive the possibility of just keeping open assembly to make sure I don't miss my slot to go and move a motion right now on a piece of secondary legislation. But I think we should keep open the option of additional evidence, including so if we're taking this additional evidence from party reps and FMDFM. I think we should be flexible around their diaries, particularly FMDFM, because their diaries are obviously most pressed. If that requires doing it on sitting days, while we know they're here on Mondays and Tuesdays, and I think we should try and do that expeditiously in order to give a bit of shape and purpose, in part because all of us as legislators are then going to be faced with, I think, what's going to be a more compressed legislative timetable in 26, and more press, more burden on all of our time.
Largely agree. We keep it open and we assess it as we go. Members broadly content with that thing?
Great.
Thank you.
I need to run to the chamber.
Agenda item number 6, which is the review of the Assembly Committee engagement on cross-cutting executive strategies. Update on call for evidence. Members will see from page 106 through to 175. Could I invite Ashley to introduce this item?
Chair, I'll keep this update and the next one as brief as action focused as I can. I appreciate under time pressure. But just to confirm, so the committee's review on committee engagement on cross-cutting executive strategies, that was a review proposed by the Executive Office, and the call for evidence has now closed for that review. The written submissions that have come in are in packs for noting for now, and we'll bring back a summary of evidence paper at a later meeting. Just of note, a couple of stakeholders have indicated that they still wish to respond to the review, so it's just getting the committee's agreement that you'll consider late responses even though the review has closed. That includes Chairperson's Liaison Group, Welsh Synod, the Oireachtas, the Committee for the Executive Office, so there's some key stakeholders there that still want to contribute. Of note, there isn't a response in from the Executive Office on this review yet, and the Executive Office proposed the review, so the committee might want to write to the Executive Office to see if it intends to respond. And that is it on that particular review.
Okay, thank you. So firstly, can I ask members whether they're content with the responses received to date? Mm-hmm. Are we also content to write again to TEO asking them for a response? Members agreed? Great. Could I seek agreement, obviously I've already asked that, sorry, in terms of writing to TEO. The correspondence would obviously indicate that on the basis the TEO proposed this review, it would be very helpful for the committee to have its views on the record. Could I seek agreement that the responses received from the departments are shared with their corresponding statutory committee for information purposes? Agreed?
Yes.
Okay. Could I ask members if they're content to consider responses received after the 30th of September closing date, which include responses from other legislatures? Agreed? Great, thank you. Could I ask members that a summary of all responses received to the committee's call for evidence will be provided at a future meeting? Agreed? Thank you, members. We'll now move on to agenda item number 7, which is the review on the development of a formal process and guidance on the handling of Westminster statutory instruments, which include a role for the Assembly and update on the call for evidence. Members will see in their packs from 178 through to 200, and also a late submission from the Cabinet Office at page 4 of table papers. Could I again invite Ashley to introduce this item?
So, Chair, the update is the same in that this was a review proposed by the Executive Office and the call for evidence has now closed. Written responses received are in packs to note for now, and we'll bring a summary of evidence paper to a future meeting. And also to note that the Scottish Parliament have indicated that they won't be responding formally. However, the committee considered that the research paper covered the position there very well, and the officials have offered to meet with me just to provide some further background. So if you're content, I'll meet with them and report back to the committee on that. Again, this is an Executive Office proposed review that the committee decided to undertake, and Executive Office haven't provided a response to this review, so again the suggestion might be that the committee write to the Executive Office to invite its views on the questions posed through the call for evidence. In addition, we understand that there may be some guidance being developed for departments in relation to the handling of Westminster SI. It would be helpful when we're writing to the Executive Office to get an update on that. And we understand as well there maybe have been some discussions between the Executive and the UK Government on the interfacing around the handling of these Westminster SIs. So again, in the same piece of correspondence, we could ask for any views or update on that.
Okay, could I ask members if they're content to note the responses to date? Are members also content to note that there has not been a response from TEO for the call for evidence, and could I seek agreement that the committee writes to TEO to ask for their views on the questions proposed through the committee's call for evidence. The correspondence would indicate that on the basis that TEO proposed this review, it would be very helpful for the committee to have its views, that officials from TEO have indicated that informal discussions between the Executive and the UK Government have commenced on the issue. Therefore, it would be helpful to have further detail on the substance of these discussions, and the committee would be grateful to receive an update on any work which may be ongoing in relation to the development of guidance for Northern Ireland departments on the handling of Westminster SIs that relate to devolved matters. Are members content with that point? Content. Thank you, members. Could I also ask us to note that the Senior Assistant Clerk will meet with officials from the Scottish Parliament to discuss the positions in Scotland and will report back to the committee. Members content? Are members also content to consider the responses received after the 30th of September deadline? Content, yeah. And can I also advise members that a summary of all responses received to the committee's call for evidence would be provided at a future meeting. Okay, move to the next agenda item, which is agenda item number 8, which is draft end of session report. Refer members to the draft end of session report at page 203. Could I advise members that the committee end of reports, session reports are produced by each committee and provide a single source of factual information on key activities, outputs and achievements. As such, they are an important tool in generating an improved understanding of the Assembly's work. Could I advise members that the Chairperson's Liaison Group agreed at its meeting on the 18th of June 2025 that the first committee end of session report since resumption of business should cover the period February 2024 to the end of August 2025. Could I advise members that the committee will consider and agree or amend each report section of the draft report in return. If a member are not content with a section, they should indicate how they would like it to be amended. Could I also refer members to the remit, powers and membership section of the report at page 203? And could I ask members if they are content with the section of the report as drafted? Members content? Could I refer members to the key activities, outputs and achievements section of the report at page 204? And could I ask members if they are content with paragraphs 1 and 2? Content? Could I ask members if they're content with paragraphs 3 to 5 on the ongoing reviews? 3 ongoing reviews. Content? Could I ask members if they're content with paragraph 6 on committee meetings? Agreed. Could I ask members if they're content with paragraph 7 on the appendix on committee expenditure? Could I ask advise members that the report will be published on the committee website in due course? Members content? Agenda item number 9 is correspondence. I have none. Agenda item number 10 is any other business. Again, I haven't been notified of any by members, or I have none myself. Agenda item number 11, which is date, time and place of next meeting. Can I inform members that the next meeting will take place on Tuesday the 4th of November, 9:30 a.m. in room 21. And at this stage, can I thank members for their participation and adjourn the meeting. Thank you.
Committee Room 21. Sound.